Welcome back to another episode of Hattrick HQ, and as you can see today, we are joined by a very special guest, hockey editor with the Score, Kyle Cushman. Welcome to the show, Kyle.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You're welcome. I guess we'll get right into it. One of the Leafs prospects that we've talked a lot about on the channel is Fraser Minten. We just want to get your thoughts on Fraser Minten and what do you think his potential is?
Yeah, Minten's an interesting player where when he was drafted, it was kind of a player that we didn't really expect to go that high in the second round. Like he had some good results and kind of built throughout the season, had a pro body, played center, that kind of stuff, but he hadn't really put everything together yet. And over the past kind of season and change, he's really kind of taken his game to that next level where he was good last season with Cam Loops on a very good team, kind of playing that second, third line center behind some top players there like Logan Stankoven and kind of guys that are now doing very well in the AHL. And kind of building his game throughout the season, kind of showcasing a really good shot, doing a lot on the power play, kind of building throughout the season. But then all of a sudden, over the summer, taking a huge step to all of a sudden being a guy that makes the Leafs out of camp. And I don't think anybody saw that coming over the summer. Like when you looked at what Minten did in the Memorial Cup and the role that he played with Cam Loops to making the Leafs out of camp as kind of a trial run as a third line center. And I think that shows both what the player is and kind of what his potential is, where I don't really see like the super high end potential for Minten. Like he's not a super skilled player in terms of like dazzling night in, night out with his playmaking or scoring or things like that. But he plays an extremely responsible game. He's very good two-way already at 19 years old, to the point where he played a defensive role in the NHL for 4 games at a camp as still being a junior age player. And he has some tools around that to be effective scoring in terms of a very good shot, kind of being effective in transition, things like that. And so as he kind of built his game, he's a very intriguing kind of top nine center that you can really look to build around as kind of a two-way pivot that can play in a lot of different situations. And so we've kind of seen that already with Hockey Canada and him being a lock for that roster at the World Juniors basically right away, despite his numbers in the WHL being good, but nothing kind of compared to some of the other guys that were kind of trying out for a roster spot. Like you look at what Jager Furcus has done in the WHL, and he was a roster cut versus Fraser Minten, who was a lock right away. And that kind of shows the difference in play style, where somebody like a Furcus is this electric goal scoring, kind of high upside, but kind of lower floor player versus Minten, who was already very good on the forecheck in the few games that he played in the NHL, going to play center, going to be an effective like 6'2" pro body to play against. And that's kind of what the Leafs saw in him when he was drafted. He's kind of built into that already. And we'll kind of see over these next few years whether he can add more to his game to kind of have more of a top six projection. But for right now, I see him as being a very, very solid kind of third line center and can probably step into that role sometime soon and can probably lock down that spot for quite a few years. And so we'll see kind of how the rest of the season goes, as his kind of start to the year has been kind of all over the place with making the Leafs out of camp and then going to the Blazers for a little bit and then getting traded and then playing a few games in Saskatoon and now being at Team Canada's camp. Like it's been all over the place for Minten right now. So I'm very curious to see both how he's used at the World Juniors and then kind of his performance in the back half of the year. Because if he can really kind of explode offensively and kind of take over that big offensive role in Saskatoon, I think that kind of starts to progress kind of what his future projection can be to see if he can unlock more of that top six upside, which I think that the Leafs are hoping to potentially see from him over the next couple of years.
Yeah, no. Another thing too is you're kind of talking about the World Juniors. What's your thoughts on Easton Cowan too? What's your thoughts on his potential? How he looked throughout the year, and just like what do you think he kind of fits in the Leafs' future mold?
Yeah, Easton Cowan has been the surprise of the year, to be quite frank. Where he when he was drafted, like we all saw the walk that he had on draft day, where none of the other first rounders had as long of a walk down the stairs as he did. And that pick was kind of criticized a little bit, where not necessarily about the player himself, but more about whether it was the right value at the end of the first round and whether the Leafs could have traded back or used a second round pick on him or all of these things. And at the time, I think a lot of the criticism was Easton Cowan has a good motor, he has some good playmaking ability, but like do you really see top six upside there? Or is he more of like a bottom six player? And if so, do you really want to use a late first round pick on that kind of player? And since then, all Easton Cowan has done is impress at every single level that he's played. It started at the rookie tournament, it carried into the Maple Leafs preseason and training camp, and he's exploded this year with London. Like the production that he's had, I did not expect whatsoever this season. He's been the best penalty killer in probably the entire CHL with what he's done on London's penalty kill there. And it's not just been shorthanded as well. Like he's been a play driver at 5-on-5. He's been productive on the power play. He's kind of taken this confidence that he's had over the summer and built it through the preseason and into the opening part of the season, and is playing with confidence, is playing as a play driver versus last year was kind of more of that secondary player as a draft eligible playing on London, one of the top teams in the OHL, and kind of not necessarily deferring to the older players on that team, but the older players on that team doing more of the play driving and Cowan kind of being that complementary piece. Whereas this year, he's been the primary play driver. And I think that's the big difference from what we kind of saw last year and maybe a bottom six projection to this year. Clearly, he's somebody that can play higher in the lineup potentially down the road. And so it's been super exciting to see from him. Nobody saw him on the World Junior radar, even as soon as like the Leafs training camp and before that. And he went out there, impressed enough in the OHL to earn a spot on this roster and seemingly a prominent spot on this roster as well. And I think that's what's exciting about Cowan is that he can play all three forward positions. He's played some left wing primarily, but he's also played center, especially through the Leafs training camp, which potentially shows that they see him as a center down the road. He can also play right wing as well, which is where he's played most recently with London. So he can play all three forward positions. He can play on the power play where he's been productive this season with London with some of his playmaking and shiftiness. He's also been great on the penalty kill, as I mentioned, as one of the top penalty killers in all of the CHL with his motor, his speed, and kind of his tenacity on the puck. And with that, you look at this Hockey Canada roster and you can play him up and down the lineup. He can be a great fourth liner. He can be a complementary piece on the top line. He can play on a second power play unit. He can play on your top penalty kill unit. And I think that's why he's on this roster as an 05, as an 18-year-old on a 19-year-old tournament. And I'm very excited to see how he does at this tournament because as we've seen throughout his game so far is that he rises to the occasion in these big games. He was excellent for London in the postseason, and that's what really pushed the Leafs to take him in the first round. He was excellent in those marquee spots with the Maple Leafs in their preseason, which sure, those aren't marquee games in the grand scheme of things, but for an 18-year-old making your first ever appearance alongside those guys, that's a marquee game for him. And he showed up in those games as well. So he's a big game player, and I'm super pumped to see him over in Sweden at the World Juniors donning that Canadian jersey, because I don't think a lot of Leafs fans, when that pick was made, expected him to be donning that jersey so quickly.
Yeah, he definitely has a bright future ahead of him. It'll be really interesting to see him coming up in this World Junior Championship tournament and then further on next year into Leafs camp to see if he can potentially crack this roster next season. But who is a Leafs prospect that might not be in some Leafs fans' radar that you think that they should probably take an eye for?
Yeah, well, he's starting to grab an eye right now, and that's Dennis Hildeby in the crease, where he's an interesting guy who wasn't really on NHL radars until his draft plus 3 season, like his last year of NHL draft eligibility. He was taken by the Maple Leafs at 21 years old, I believe it was, as a goaltender out of Sweden who hadn't really played much at the professional level, had been good at the junior level that season, but as like a 21-year-old, you kind of expect that at that point, but was taken by the Leafs as kind of a mid-round guy in the 4th round. They actually traded into that slot to take him. And since then, all he's done is really stop pucks. He was very good last season in the Swedish league, kind of trading starts with Matt Tompkins, who's now in the Tampa Bay Lightning organization, has come over to the Marlies now and been excellent here in the AHL. Like you look at the numbers that he's posted versus what Keith Petruzzelli's done and even what Martin Jones has done, and it's night and day. Like we're talking about 920 plus save percentage versus 2 guys that are under 880 on the season. Like he's been somebody that could have come into the season, kind of struggled to adapt to the North American style and kind of been like a backup third stringer that gets the odd start, and Mueller kind of focuses on kind of the development aspect with kind of the goalie coaches and skills coaches. But instead, he's taken the Marlies starting role. Like Keith Petruzzelli was the guy most likely coming into the season. Hildeby has taken that job. Martin Jones could have outplayed both of those guys and kind of taken the bulk of those starts just from a competitive standpoint. Hildeby's outplayed him. And so when you look at a 22-year-old goaltender who's listed at like 6'6", 6'7", 220 plus pounds, like he's a massive goaltender. And you look what he's done over the past couple of years since having double hip surgery. All he's done is stop pucks. And so he's not really somebody that I expect to get NHL games this season just because of the kind of guys that the Maple Leafs have, Martin Jones being a third stringer, kind of bringing Hildeby over to the American League and kind of giving him a full season to kind of get those reps under his belt. But he's clearly the top goaltending prospect in the system right now, if you exclude Joseph Woll, who is clearly an NHL goaltender now. And when you look at the age, the results over the past few years, the size, all of the elements of this game, he screams a future NHL goaltender. And he's somebody that I don't think a lot of Leafs fans really know the name of because he hasn't really been over in North America very long. Like he's only made 12 or 15 AHL games so far. But he's somebody that should certainly be on Maple Leafs fans' radars because he's somebody that I think is one of the highest upside potential players in the organization right now.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. It's nice to see all these Leafs prospects kind of developing, getting into the lineups, even it's preseason in the AHL. But who's a prospect around the league? It could be on any team that
Mm-hmm.
people might not look at a lot, but you think has a lot of star potential.
Yeah, that's a great question because you kind of look around the league and there's a lot of interesting guys who are kind of these high upside bets through kind of early rounds or middle rounds, and it's kind of like what are they gonna kind of develop into? And somebody that I've kind of loved his game over the past few years, and I was surprised to see him cut. I kind of mentioned him earlier is Jagger Firkus. He's a Seattle Kraken prospect who has put up essentially a goal per game right now in the Western League, and he didn't have a great camp with Hockey Canada, and he was cut. We'll see if he ends up getting back on the roster if they don't get any help from the NHL. But he's this kind of slight, smaller kid who has an absolutely wicked shot. Like the stuff he does beating goaltenders in the WHL is ridiculous for his size. He's like 5'9", 5'10", like 160 pounds, and he shoots the puck like some of the best that you've seen. And so he's somebody that I'm not sure most people know just because right now he's not going to play on a Canadian World Junior team. He's playing out west in the Western League. He's a prospect for a team in Seattle as well. That isn't one of the marquee teams in terms of getting that prospect coverage up here in Canada at the very least. And so you kind of take all those factors in, and I think he's somebody that could surprise over these next couple of years, being a guy that kind of bursts onto the scene maybe next season in the AHL, and we'll kind of see how that transition goes. But for a Seattle team that has been good to this point, but we're kind of seeing this year some struggles scoring and things like that. I think he's certainly a guy that can step into that lineup in a couple years' time and really pop offensively if he's kind of given that opportunity in the top six, which you would expect given his offensive talents down the road. And so like you look at guys in the AHL that are doing well, like a Logan Stankoven and stuff, like people know that name for the most part just because he played at two World Junior teams and excelled there, and he's going to be good in Dallas and things like that. And I wouldn't be surprised if somebody like a Jagger Firkus kind of not quite as quickly as Stankoven has kind of taken over the AHL, but in a couple of years, we're looking at kind of Firkus stepping into Seattle lineup and being like, wow, who's this like redheaded, mustached electric goal scorer making waves in Seattle? And I think that he's somebody that when he does make the league is gonna, especially with his look and kind of his play style and all that kind of stuff, is gonna kind of become a fan favorite once he makes the league.
Yeah, it's always nice to look around the league and see who's next up because, I mean, it's going to happen. All these guys are eventually going to make the league. And, you got the big names like Connor Bedard and Logan Cooley and all these guys. But it's nice to hear your insight on some of the names that people may not know. And I just want to thank you again for coming on today, sharing your insight with our viewers. And I just want you to tell our viewers where they can find you if they want to go give you a follow.
Yeah, well, for starters, thanks for having me, guys. It's been great to see your success over these past few months. You guys are doing great stuff. You can find my stuff primarily on Twitter at Kyle_Cush, CUSH, not KUSH. You go a very different place if you spell it the other way. And that's where you can find all of my stuff. Primarily right for the score. That's my full-time gig, doing a lot of coverage over there, especially this month in December leading up to the World Juniors. Going to have a lot of fun coverage for that coming up over the next couple of weeks. Taking a big role on our women's league coverage as well, with that starting up on January 1st. Very excited for the PWHL and telling some of the stories and getting some of that set up over there as well. And of course, a lot of my Maple Leafs prospect coverage being primarily on Twitter as well. So you can find all of that stuff at Kyle_Cush on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, can't wait to see what you got coming up. Really appreciate it again for you coming on. And as always, I've been your host, KC, alongside my co-host, Mark Pye. Keep your stick on the ice.